Hello, IB Environmental students. Today we're going to start talking about some climate change solutions, specifically mitigation. We'll also talk about a little bit of viewpoints. All right, let's jump in. So when we talk about the strategies to change what's happening with regards to climate change, there's a lot of different strategies people take. So there's the do nothing, the wait and see, and the precautionary. Let's talk about them each. So let's start with the do nothing, and then we'll talk about the other two next. The do nothing approach is usually climate skeptics, and they're worrying that if we do stuff about climate change, we'll have issues with economic development, or technology can just solve these issues in the future. Those do nothing people literally want to do nothing. All right? The next one is our wait and see approach. Usually this is still pretty dangerous if it takes a while for us to see solutions for our results. All right? So it might be tough to get a global government and economies to agree on something. So this would be, let's say, maybe we'll see if there's some changes in 10 or 15 years and then we'll do something. Well, that still makes us pretty worried. The tipping point is a term that means if our actions, once we finally do something about them, what if they have little to no effect because we're already in a positive feedback loop and any changes we do aren't effective and we're already at a brand new equilibrium of a warm planet? This would be pretty bad. All right, so wait and see. We as climate scientists still think this approach is not the best. Our last approach is the one that we as climate scientists are pretty sure that this is the best approach. It's the precautionary approach. It's the majority choice. Act now just in case. Even if we find out burning fossil fuels isn't really the 100% major cause of global warming, we still know those fossil fuels are finite and we really can make changes. There's three major categories of changes that we could talk about, and those are international commitments, national action, and personal lifestyle changes. I would like you to think throughout the upcoming slides how the different ideas kind of fit into those categories and why some of those changes might be harder than others, making a personal change versus an international change versus a regional national change. All right, so let's learn about this idea of changes. All right, we have this term called climate mitigation, which is exactly that. Let's change what we're doing. And so usually this is going to involve some sort of reduction or stabilization of the greenhouse gas emissions, whether it's carbon dioxide or something else. All right, usually this is a human-based intervention to reduce that human-enhanced greenhouse effect. And this is based on our precautionary principle that we are impacting the change. We're going to go over three major categories of mitigation. They are as follows: stabilize and reduce the greenhouse gas emission, remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, or geoengineer. I'm going to jump in because we got a lot to cover. All right, let's look at those different mitigation strategies. So mitigation option number one was stabilize or reduce the greenhouse gas emissions. Our first category of that would be, let's reduce the overall energy consumption. We could do this in a variety of ways. I highly recommend you jot down all of these because they're all really important. We could do a personal decision like buy a hybrid car, pay car tolls, or buy energy efficient light bulbs. All of those things could help reduce our overall energy consumption. All right, but we could also nationally adopt carbon taxes or remove our fossil fuel subsidies, because right now buying gas is actually cheaper than it would be if our government wasn't subsidizing it in the US. We could also have personal carbon credits, which could be traded as we look at our carbon footprints. This could be on an individual level, but it's probably more reasonable to do this on a state or even private company level. We could also set national limits on greenhouse gas production, because right now it doesn't matter how many people or where you live, there aren't any limits for how much the US should be producing versus how much a small nation in Africa should be producing. And maybe that's not fair. So this is our first option of stabilizing or reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Let's jump into another thing under this umbrella category in red. We could also reduce the emissions specifically of nitrous oxide or methane. Specifically, these things are going to be related to agriculture. So we'd make agricultural changes such as let's have better diets for our cows since they're producing the most methane, all right? And so are some of our other agricultural things. We could also capture the methane coming out of landfills. And we could just overall use better soil and sustainable agricultural processes. That's going to really limit those nitrous oxides and methane production since our previous one was mostly focused on the CO2. Let's do another one. In general, we could just reduce our use of fossil fuels by using alternative fuels, such as hydroelectric, nuclear, solar, or wind, which we've talked about before in our energy unit. All of these would definitely lower greenhouse gas emissions, specifically mostly our friend carbon dioxide, but even things like methane. All right, so that was our overall option number 1, stabilize or reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Let's jump into option number 2. Option number 2 is let's actually assume that the CO2 is in the atmosphere. Let's figure out ways to grab it from the atmosphere. One option for this would be let's increase the amount of photosynthesis. If we increase the amount of photosynthesis, we're pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere because we know a lot about the carbon cycle. We could add forests or just limit the amount of deforestation, and all these parts of the plant, they are going to be pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis, all right? That's going to be in their leaves, it's going to be in the bark, it's going to be in the trunk, and then even that's going to help the CO2 end up in the carbon sink of the soil. So we call it a carbon sink if that's a place where carbon ends up staying for a long period of time. All right, so that's one option. Another option is we could capture the carbon and store it. This is really interesting because this is assuming that it's already in the atmosphere, that carbon dioxide, and now, while it's kind of getting out into the atmosphere, before it quite gets there, we're going to grab it from power stations, oil refineries, or other industries. This is easier because it's before it's actually released out into the atmosphere, because once it's dissipated and kind of dispersing in the atmosphere, it's really hard to capture. However, getting these technologies into all those industrial areas is really expensive to capture, but then we also have to transport it and figure out a way to store. And not all rocks or bedrocks are really good for storage. The next one is let's just use more biomass in general. So not just reforest an area, maybe we should focus on biomass as a fuel source. Because if we're using biomass as a fuel source instead of fossil fuels, like that's burning things like wood, but it's also maybe using ethanol as a biofuel. And now our gas has a lot of ethanol in it. That means every time we're burning that biofuel, we're also going to have to replant those crops. So if we're using a little bit of corn ethanol in our gas, then we have to replant that corn to get more of it. So it's a very sustainable circular process because we're depending on growing more of it, and that's going to store more CO2 as we grow it. So it's a carbon neutral process. So our third option is usually thought to be the most drastic option. It's called geoengineering. Geoengineering is defined as a large-scale human intervention project that's very technocentric because it involves technology. One geoengineering example is scattering iron, but it could have been nitrates or phosphates into a place like the ocean, and this would be able to increase algal blooms. So if we off this boat add iron into the ocean, the iron might stimulate phytoplankton or algal growth, and that'll cause eventually the algae to die. But before they die, they hopefully are doing lots of photosynthesis, just like how trees do photosynthesis, and they're going to grab it. And when they die, they're going to drop out that CO2 into the bottom of the ocean and hopefully act as a carbon sink. So this is all good and well, however, we're never sure if this could go poorly. This is something that's really hard to test in a lab, and doing this on a wide scale in the ocean could be pretty dangerous. And we're really not sure if this could end up like eutrophication and end up actually depleting oxygen from the water, which could be very bad. Another large-scale geoengineering process would be releasing sulfur dioxide by plane. This is the same chemical that is released from volcanic eruptions, which you can see in this picture. So in a volcanic eruption, that blocks out a lot of sunlight, and if I'm blocking out sunlight, that sunlight can't warm the earth as easily. This is really interesting, but we know sulfur dioxide is part of the acid rain unit that we learned about. That's SOx. So this is very well going to end up creating acid deposition and make our soils more acidic and affect our aquatic and terrestrial environments. So there's definitely a downside to this one as well. Next one is really interesting and very sci-fi. It is sending mirrors into space so that they can deflect the light. This is really like a James Bond movie, but we would hope that it would deflect the solar radiation. But let's say, who's in charge of it? Is it going to accidentally turn the mirrors so that it ends up sending these really high energy rays at somebody and cause a drought? So this is very an unclear area of how this would be managed and worked. The last one we're going to go over right now is building white roofs, and this is going to increase albedo or reflectivity, and that's really great because that's just going to deflect the light off. So it's going to act like ice or a white shirt in the summertime, and that's going to cause the building to be less hot. You're going to have to use less AC, and overall it's going to lower the temperature of that city area if more places did this. This one's rather the easiest of those options to do and has the least impact. There are plenty of other geoengineering ideas, and all of them have pros and cons, as well as all of the other mitigation options described. You in class are going to be deciding which of these mitigation options seems like it would make the biggest impact without the least problems. All right, great job, guys. See you in class.